Welcome to Life Stories. What would you do if your 8-year-old child stood up in court and exposed a truth that no one else dared to say out loud? What if the person he exposed was his own father? This isn't just a story about custody. It's about silence, control, and the quiet courage of a little boy who refused to let fear win. In the space between a mother's trembling hands and a child's steady voice, something extraordinary happened. And once it did, nothing could ever go back to the way it was. Stay with us, because by the end of this story, you might just see bravery and love in a way you never have before. Now let's go back to the day everything changed. The courtroom was quiet, not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that feels like it's holding its breath just before something breaks. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow across the polished wood, the judge's bench, the two attorneys murmuring behind their folders. Rachel sat at the plaintiff's table, hands clenched tightly in her lap, nails digging into the skin of her palm. Her son, Eli, just 8 years old, swung his feet nervously beside her, the tips of his sneakers brushing the bench's edge. He looked small in his gray jacket, but his face was older that day, as if he'd aged in the waiting. Across the aisle, Blake sat with his lawyer, legs spread, confident, calm, wearing that same rehearsed smirk he'd always worn whenever he believed the world owed him something. He didn't look at Rachel. He never did. Not really. He looked through her, as if she were an obstacle, not a person. Judge Callahan adjusted his glasses and flipped through a few pages, the only sound in the room the turning of dry paper. Then he looked up, steady, professional. "Mr. Blake Carter," he said, "you're petitioning for a change in custody. You've stated the child has expressed a desire to live with you full-time. Is that correct?" Blake stood. "Yes, Your Honor. Eli told me he doesn't feel safe in his current environment." His voice was smooth, practiced, each word calculated for effect. Rachel's stomach turned. Safe, that word. How easily he used it, twisted it. Rachel turned to Eli, whose hands were folded in his lap, knuckles white. He didn't look up. He was too still. She wanted to reach for him, to pull him into her arms and protect him from all of this, from Blake, from the eyes watching him. But she couldn't move. Neither could he. The judge's gaze shifted to the boy. "Eli," he said gently, "is that true? Do you want to live with your father?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Rachel's heart stopped. She wanted to scream, to yell that it wasn't fair to ask a child to choose like this, under these lights, under this pressure, with his father's shadow cast long beside him. But she said nothing. She couldn't. Her voice was gone. Eli stood, slowly. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a phone, her old one, scratched at the corners, screen slightly cracked. "I'd like to play something," he said, barely above a whisper. Blake's head snapped toward him. The smirk vanished. The judge blinked. "Play something?" "A recording," Eli said, "from last night." A beat of silence. Then the judge nodded to the bailiff. "Bring it here." Eli hesitated, then stepped forward and placed the phone on the judge's bench. "I didn't know if anyone would believe me," he said, "so I recorded it." Rachel's breath caught. She had felt something was off. The last few weekends, Eli had returned from Blake's house, quieter, reserved, asking strange questions. He'd stopped sleeping through the night. He'd started watching the door too much, like he was waiting for something to break through it. She should have known. The judge picked up the phone. He pressed play. Static. Then Blake's voice, sharp and low. "You're going to say you want to live with me, Eli. If you don't, I swear I'll make sure your mother disappears. You understand me?" Eli's voice, small, trembling. "But I want to stay with Mom." Blake again, more forceful now. "That's not your choice. You're just a kid. Say what I told you, or things get worse for her." The room didn't move. Not a breath, not a whisper. Even Blake's lawyer sat frozen, color draining from his face. Rachel felt her world tilt. The sound of that voice, the one she had lived under for years, now echoing off courtroom walls. The judge didn't flinch. He played it again. When it ended, he slowly removed his glasses. "Mr. Carter," he said, "is that your voice?" Blake tried to speak, but only managed, "It sounds like it," before the judge cut him off. Rachel glanced at Eli, who had returned to her side. He didn't look up, just squeezed her hand tightly. His small body was tense, but he hadn't run. He hadn't cried. She had spent years protecting him from Blake's darkness, never realizing that her son, her little boy who still collected stones in his backpack and drew superheroes on his math homework, had learned how to protect her back. Eli had exposed something in that room that no cross-examination could bury. And Blake knew it. He didn't speak again. Not a word. Not as the judge recessed court for review. Not as lawyers shuffled papers. He sat there, statue still, with the look of a man whose weapon had just turned in his hand. Have you ever seen courage from someone so small it left you speechless? What would you risk to protect someone who once protected you? The judge returned 15 minutes later, but the balance of power in that courtroom had already shifted forever. And what he said next would change everything. Judge Callahan returned to the bench with a stillness that commanded silence. The room, still reeling from the recording, seemed smaller now, closer, like the truth had bent the walls inward. Rachel's hands trembled in her lap, her fingers still warm from Eli's small, determined grip. Her son sat beside her, not speaking, but not hiding either. His gaze remained forward, unblinking, like he knew something had shifted, something irreversible. The judge cleared his throat and looked directly at Blake. "I've reviewed the audio multiple times," he said, his voice calm but sharpened with authority. "There is no doubt in my mind that the voice on that recording is yours, Mr. Carter." Blake's jaw tensed, but he didn't speak. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but Blake's posture remained rigid, like a man sinking into concrete. "You threatened a child," the judge continued, in an attempt to manipulate the outcome of a legal proceeding. "That is not only unethical, but deeply disturbing. Effective immediately, your request for custody is denied. All visitation is suspended pending formal review, including a mandatory psychological evaluation and completion of a parental responsibility program." Murmurs spread like static across the room. Rachel felt the breath rush from her lungs, not relief, not yet. Just the sensation of weight beginning to lift. For a moment, she closed her eyes. But the judge wasn't finished. He turned his gaze toward Rachel. "Miss Green," he said, "your son has shown remarkable bravery, and the court recognizes the stability and care you've provided. Full legal and physical custody will remain with you until further notice." Then, to Eli. "Young man, what you did today took courage many adults struggle to find. I want you to know your voice mattered. It changed things." Eli nodded once, but Rachel saw the way his shoulders dropped. Not from fear, but from release. The gavel fell. People stood. Papers rustled. The bailiff stepped forward, but Rachel remained seated, too stunned to move. She turned to her son and cupped his face, trying to smile through the storm of emotion. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered, voice catching. "But you did." Eli blinked up at her. "I just wanted them to know the truth," he said. "I didn't want you to get hurt." It was in that moment, cradling her son's truth in her hands, that Rachel felt something else begin to take root. Not just victory, not even healing, but something darker, older, a quiet fury she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Blake had almost won. She thought she had escaped when she left that night with a backpack and a 5-year-old, but she hadn't. She'd been surviving in fragments, smiling through exhaustion, laughing for Eli's sake, building a life on the edge of a threat she never named. And now, finally, someone else had seen him for what he was. The mask had cracked, but Rachel knew masks had layers. She had lived beneath them. In the hallway, Susan was waiting, arms wide, her embrace wrapping around them like armor. "You raised a brave boy," she whispered, her voice thick. Rachel clung to her mother for a second longer than she intended. Then, as they stepped out into the sunlight, the fresh air felt foreign. Eli looked up at her, the boy she'd fought for, the boy who had stood for her in return. But just as she reached for his hand, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Unknown number. One voicemail. Later that night, once Eli was asleep and the house was quiet, she listened. The voice was unmistakable, low, slow, and colder than she remembered. "You think this is over? You humiliated me in court with that kid and your little show. You want full custody? Fine, but you don't get to ruin my life and walk away. I'm not done." Rachel froze. The room seemed to grow smaller. A part of her wanted to drop the phone. Another part, A stronger, sharper part wanted to scream, but she didn't. Instead, she stood in the middle of the living room and played the message again. There was no anger in Blake's voice, just calculation. It wasn't over. She forwarded the voicemail to her attorney and the court-appointed caseworker immediately. Then she saved it to a flash drive, labeled it in her email, and took a long breath. Not because she was afraid, but because she realized something else. Blake's obsession wasn't custody. It was control. And now that he'd lost that, he would reach in other ways: legal, emotional, psychological, whatever leverage he thought he could find. Rachel wasn't going to wait for him to knock again. She began documenting everything. Every text, every call, every noise outside her door that felt out of place. She installed a new lock, changed her routine, and when Eli asked her the next morning if she was okay, she smiled and said yes. But behind that smile, something in her had solidified. This was no longer about survival. It was about ending something. What would you do if the threat you escaped came back quieter, smarter, and more dangerous than before? As Rachel prepares for the next storm, one thing becomes clear. The courtroom wasn't the final battle. It was just the first time the truth was heard. And Blake, he's not done yet. Winter came early that year. The leaves outside Rachel's apartment barely had time to turn before cold rain stripped them bare. Eli sat at the kitchen table, humming quietly as he colored a picture of a rocket ship, crayons scattered around like confetti. Rachel watched him from the stove, stirring soup with one hand and clutching her phone in the other. Another call from an unknown number. She didn't answer. She hadn't for weeks. Not since the voicemail. Not since the court ordered a restraining order against Blake. The police had visited once, filed a report, advised her to stay vigilant, and left her with a number to call if anything felt wrong. But nothing about this felt right. She hadn't seen Blake since that day in court, but his presence clung to her life like smoke. No flames, just the thick, invisible reminder that the fire had been real. She tried not to let Eli see. Tried to keep life moving forward. Keep the routine intact. School, library trips, Saturday morning pancakes. But sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet and the air too still, she found herself standing by the front window, watching the street, waiting for headlights that never came. Until one night, they did. It was just past midnight. Rain whispered against the glass, and Rachel was sitting on the couch with a blanket pulled around her shoulders, reading through her journal. She'd started writing again, small entries, just enough to keep her grounded. When the car slowed outside her building, her body responded before her mind caught up. Adrenaline, pulse, breath pulled tight. She moved to the window, parted the curtain, and there it was, a black SUV idling under the street lamp. Her chest tightened. She reached for her phone, thumb hovered over 911. But the car didn't park. It didn't stop. It sat for a moment, then pulled away. Still, she couldn't sleep that night. The next morning, a note was taped to her door. No envelope, just a single sheet of paper, handwritten in the tight, angular script she knew too well. You're not the only one who knows how to record things. Watch your back. She stared at the words for a long time before peeling the paper off the door and locking it away in a drawer. Then she called her lawyer, and the police, and finally, her mother. Susan came over within the hour. She brought groceries, hugged Eli, then pulled Rachel aside. "You have to stop reacting like prey," she said gently, brushing a strand of hair from Rachel's face. "You're not running anymore, honey. You stood your ground in that courtroom. He's the one who's afraid now." "I don't feel strong," Rachel whispered. "You don't have to feel it," Susan said. "You just have to remember it." A week later, Rachel got the call. Blake had been arrested. He'd shown up at his office drunk, started shouting about court corruption, about his family being stolen. Security called the police. When they searched his car, they found a small recorder filled with audio files, most unintelligible, but one recorded outside Rachel's building. His voice, hers, Eli's. He'd been there. That was enough. The judge issued an extended restraining order and scheduled a new custody hearing, this time to determine whether Blake would be allowed any contact at all in the foreseeable future. Rachel didn't know what she felt. Not relief. Not yet. She'd spent so long holding her breath that exhaling still felt unnatural. But the night before the hearing, something unexpected happened. Eli had a nightmare. Rachel woke to the sound of crying and found him curled up on the floor beside his bed, trembling. "I dreamed he took you away," he sobbed. "And I couldn't stop him this time." She gathered him into her arms, held him until the shaking stopped, and whispered, "You saved me already, baby. That's never going to happen." But in that moment, something in her broke. Not from fear, but from guilt. Eli was 8, and yet he carried memories too heavy for most adults. He had stood in a courtroom and saved her with a recording. But who had been there to save him? How many nights had he kept quiet so she wouldn't worry? How many times had he swallowed his fear so she could sleep? She stayed up the rest of the night, staring at the ceiling, her son safe beside her, and she made a decision. The next morning, at court, when Judge Callahan asked if she had any additional statements, she stood. "Your Honor," she said, her voice firm but soft, "I am not here to retaliate. I'm here to protect my son. Blake Carter has made choices that have endangered that safety, but more than that, he's left scars I can't see. I don't know what the future holds, but I know this: Eli deserves peace. He deserves to grow up without looking over his shoulder. I am asking this court not for vengeance, but for closure. Let this end here." The courtroom was quiet again, but this time it felt different. Final. When the gavel struck, Blake was stripped of all visitation rights indefinitely, with no possibility of unsupervised contact. He would be required to undergo long-term counseling and to a psychological evaluation every 6 months to even request review. He didn't fight. He didn't speak. He didn't look at Rachel as he was escorted out. That night, Rachel and Eli made waffles for dinner. He asked if they could build a fort in the living room. They did. They watched cartoons until they fell asleep, curled in blankets under the soft hum of fairy lights. In the dark, Rachel watched her son's chest rise and fall, slow and steady, and for the first time in years, she felt it: safety. Not just his, her own. Weeks passed. Eli laughed more, slept deeper. One Saturday morning, he brought her a drawing of a courtroom with a small boy holding a phone and a judge smiling down. "It's me," he said, "and you're in the back, but I made you taller." She laughed. "I don't think I'm that tall." He grinned. "You are to me." And that was the moment she knew. They had made it out, not unscarred, not untouched, but whole. What part of this story stayed with you the most? Leave a comment if it moved you. Type 100 if you loved the story. Tell us where in the world you're watching from. Share this video with someone who needs to believe in strength, healing, and the power of one voice. Thank you for watching Life Stories.